ninth chapter here in Ecclesiastes, and the last verse, but we'll look at the last two here. Beginning at verse 17, Solomon writes, "The words of the wise heard in quiet are better than the shouting of a ruler among fools. Wisdom is better than weapons of war, but one sinner destroys much good." The words of the wise, he talks about, the importance of it, the value of it. Words of wisdom are greater, as he points out here, than weapons of war. Earlier in this chapter, we talked about this last week, he gives an example of a small city that was besieged by a great king, and great siege works were laid up against it. So it looks like there's no way they can be victorious, but there is a poor wise man in that town. And about up there at about verse 14, when it talks about this, it says in verse 15, "But there was found in it a poor wise man, and he by his wisdom delivered the city." So this is evidence of the fact that wisdom can be greater and is greater than weapons of war. And that's important. It's better than that. But yet he points out one sinner destroys much good. You know, a lot of good things can be accomplished by a person of wisdom. But just one little act of foolishness can ruin all of it. I don't know how many times, you think about things like that happening. How many of you here, and probably how many of you watched the movie Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory? Yeah, a lot of you have. I had a good friend of mine that we used to talk about that movie sometimes and the things we remembered from it. And the thing he always remembered was a statement made by Willy Wonka when he said, "A little foolishness now and then is found in the wisest of men." And that's true. Everybody has those moments in their lives when they're involved in just a little bit of foolishness. And normally, I would think about that back then, some of the silly and stupid things I'd done, I didn't think much about it at all. But what Solomon is telling us is that just a little bit of foolishness can destroy a lot of great good that's been accomplished in the life of a person. And I think the Bible gives us examples of that and how that one sinner can destroy much good. One sinner by some foolish act can destroy so much good. Can you think of any examples in the Bible? I've got 3 of them that I've marked down here, but I know there've got to be a lot more than that. Can you think of any example of someone in the Bible who by a little act of foolishness destroyed a lot of good? Okay. And what was his foolishness?
He didn't obey God. He sacrificed what he should have.
Right. Decided he wanted to make that sacrifice to God because the priest, Samuel, wasn't there at that time. And the way he talks about it and the way he tries to justify it, you could almost think, well, I can see why he would do that. But that little act of foolishness brought defeat to them.
He didn't destroy everything.
Right.
He didn't kill Agag or any of it.
Yeah, left him alive. And, but he tried to justify all of it, and all those sheep that we kept alive. We didn't keep it alive to enrich ourselves. We did that to offer the sacrifices to God. And it sounds good, but it was foolishness because it was disobedience to God. And really, that's what foolishness is so many times you see in the lives of people. It's that disobedience to God. That's why he makes the statement here in regard to that wisdom is better than weapons of war, but one sinner destroys much good. What about Achan? What did Achan do? Okay, he took that treasure there from the city of Jericho when God had said all of those things were devoted to God. But he saw that wedge of silver and in those Babylonian garments, and he took all of that for himself and he hid it in the tent, in his own tent there. And as a result, what happened? Yeah, there were several. Well, yeah, he and his family were going to be killed for it. But as a result of, when they went up to battle against Ai, Israel was defeated. And there were a number of Israelites killed because of his foolishness. There was a man by the name of Doeg I don't know if you remember much about him, D-O-E-G. But Doeg, the Bible talks about it in 1 Samuel chapter 22. This was a time when David has been fleeing for his life from Saul. And Doeg sees David when he came there and asked for food from the priest. And the priest gave him and his men the unleavened bread that was right only for the priest to eat. He said, I'll give you that if your men have kept themselves from women. And the only weapon he had there was a sword that had belonged to the giant Goliath. And he gave that to David. Well, Doeg saw this, and he goes back and he tells Saul what's happened. And Saul commands his men to kill those priests. And none of them would do it. But Doeg did. You know, his foolishness that led to the death of those men. And then something I'd never thought about before, but this is something that Brother Kaufman pointed out. He talked about Bathsheba. That one sin, when she bathed nude in the sight, of others. And King David saw it, and that led to his sin with her, a sin of lust. It led to sin of adultery, that led to sin of murder, and eventually led, to the downfall of the kingdom through Solomon and Solomon's son Rehoboam that caused all that. So it doesn't take a whole lot. Just one sinner, by one act, can destroy a lot of good that's been done. And maybe, some have suggested, maybe that's why when Jesus wrote to the church at Laodicea in Revelation chapter 3 and verse 17, he said, I would that you were cold or hot rather than being lukewarm. Just that one little thing that we do in life that may be such a little thing, a little foolish act, they can destroy much good. William Barclay told of a man, and I've forgotten this gentleman's name, but he was a fairly famous individual, and someone had approached him about writing a book, a biography of this man's life, and the man refused to allow that to be done. And when he was asked why, he said, because I've seen too many men fall out on the last lap in their life. In other words, don't write a book about my life until I'm dead. And you can be sure that I've lived a life that deserves to be written about. Not somebody that lived a good life and then toward the end commits some foolishness that destroys all of his influence for good. And I don't know what's going to happen with Judge Kavanaugh. But, if what's being said about him is one foolish act, could destroy, his life, keep him from being Supreme Court Justice, tell him what it'll do to his family, too many times things like that happen to us in life. We can go along living such a good life, faithfully serving God, and then one act can destroy all of that. And so here at the end of the chapter, and like I said last week, Brother Kaufman believes that through chapter 9 is dealing primarily with the times when Solomon has turned away from God, and he's recounting his life. He's telling about all those things and what it was like when he wasn't serving God the way he should. And when you get to chapter 10, you're going to start seeing some changes, and he start moving back toward God. And it's just interesting here in chapter 10 because it's just a series of miscellaneous proverbs that he gives. And when you think about Solomon and Proverbs, what do you think about? He wrote an entire book. It's called Proverbs with all of them. I've not counted up, not all of the Proverbs there written by him, but a lot of them, of his Proverbs are given there. But in the book of 1 Kings chapter 4 and verse 32, the statement is made of Solomon, says he also uttered 3,000 proverbs. This is one of the things that Solomon is known for, the proverbs that he had. Proverbs are things that are general truths. It's not something that would necessarily be true in every instance of life, but generally these are truths that you would find in life. And so here in chapter 10, he's going back to a miscellaneous number of proverbs that he gives here for the people. And so as we begin looking at this here in chapter 10, and I'm getting behind here on this, but dealing with this, he's going to start talking about the hurtfulness of folly, the foolish things that we do, and the danger that it poses to us in life, not only to ourselves but to others. And so beginning here in chapter 10, verses 1 through 4, he said, dead flies putrefy the perfumer's ointment and cause it to give off a foul odor. So does a little folly to one respected for wisdom and honor. A wise man's heart is at his right hand, but a fool's heart at his left. Even when a fool walks along the way, he lacks wisdom, and he shows everyone that he is a fool. If the spirit of the ruler rises against you, do not leave your post, for conciliation pacifies great offenses. So here begin with 4 different little proverbs that he gives here that are important to us. And this first one that he makes is just in keeping what he has just talked about there at the end of chapter 9. Because here he talks about how the foolish things we do, and the effect that it has on our lives, and how it can destroy so much good in our lives. And the one thing that he makes mention to here is about dead flies. Now the fly is not a very big insect, but he talks about how that, dead flies in ointment, or some translations have a perfume, cause it to give off a foul odor. And so here's something that's meant to give a pleasant odor, and there are millions of dollars made every year by people purchasing perfumes, things to help them smell better. But just something as small as a fly getting into it can cause it to give off a foul odor, to destroy the good. Now he said, just like that is the case with that, he said the same thing is true in the lives of people. When just a little bit of folly in our lives can wreck all the good that we've done. And so how careful we need to be to not allow that into our lives. Be careful about what we do and how we live. And so that a person can live an honorable life filled with many righteous and good deeds that he does, but all of that can be destroyed by just a little bit of foolishness in his life. Now, the second thing that he talks about here, I put up here in this is the New King James in it, but look at verse 2. It says, a wise man's heart is at his right hand, but a fool's heart is at his left. Now, looking at that, what Brother Kaufman suggested by this was that when you talk about the heart, a wise man's heart, you're looking in primarily, he says, at his intelligence, at his conscience, and his will. And so a wise man's heart is set, he says, at his right hand. The idea seems to be the wise man is someone who's going to do what's right. His heart is set toward doing what is right. He's got his intelligence and his will, and all that's under the control of God. And so it's set toward right. But the fool's heart is at his left. He's set on foolishness. He's set on doing things that aren't right, that aren't good. Now, most every translation I've looked at, it renders it that way, except for the Revised Standard. And the Revised Standard is what I've been using in here. That's not the Revised Standard there. Someone have a Revised Standard? Or maybe you've got a Bible. Huh? All right, what does it say? All right. The wise will go the right way, the fool's going to go the wrong way. That's the way I'd always thought about it. But somebody here used to have the English Revised, or the English version. It's what Richard uses all the time. And a lot of times it's the same as RSV's. Well, let me read what the RSV says in regard to that. A wise man's heart inclines him toward the right, but a fool's heart toward the left. Now that's the literal reading of it. It's not toward the wrong. As I thought, well, if the wise go to the right, the fool's going to go to the wrong. The wise goes to the right, the fool goes to the left. Not making any political statements. But that's the way I've heard people use this. And I'd never thought anything about it before in my life, because I just assumed that if wisdom leads you to the right, fools are going to lead you to the wrong. But the contrast that's given here in the language, it's from the right to the left. But I think the whole thing of it boiled down to is, listen, the wise man, his wisdom is going to lead him to obedience to God, to doing what's right. But the foolish man, he's always going to tend toward that which is wrong. He's doing foolish things. He's disobeying God. He's going the wrong way. And so, wisdom, that's again another reason why wisdom is so important to us in life. Because that can help direct us in the right way we need to go in service to God and living for God. And then the third thing that he mentions, let me get back to this. Even when the fool walks on the road, he lacks sense. And he says to everyone that he is a fool. Now again, that could be understood in more than one way. Look at that latter part. He says to everyone that he is a fool. How might you understand that? Okay. You look at it in the one sense that he is saying, what the fool does is by his actions, the fool is saying to everybody, I'm a fool. My actions are showing I'm a fool. But also it could be he says to everyone, he's a fool. He's a fool. He's a fool. And some of the translations render it that way. So that's two different ways they have of seeing something like this. But anyhow, the main thrust is, again, that a fool by his actions shows everybody that he's a fool. What's that old statement? I think this might even been a proverb too. It's better to remain silent and remove all. Okay, yeah. And because that's what a fool does. By his actions, by the things that he says, he's letting everybody know he's a fool. He's showing it. What translation was that you had, Charlotte? NIV. He's telling everybody that he's stupid. Yeah. He makes it, known. Moffat rendered this passage. He says, even on a walk, the fool shows lack of sense, for he calls everyone a fool. So that's the way he renders it. The fool is a person who calls everyone a fool. And I think it's like it sometimes. A person that's a fool doesn't realize it. He thinks he's brilliant, that he's smart. Everybody else sees a fool. And that's why you don't agree with me. Because if you weren't a fool, you would agree with me. That's the way he looks at it. Brother Kaufman put in there, he said, this reminds the writer, talking about himself, this reminds me of a traffic sign on a very dangerous curve on an old Tennessee highway many years ago. The sign read, quote, slow down. You might meet another fool. A fool shows he's a fool by his actions. So slow down, because you might meet somebody else that's a fool, and he's not driving the way he should, and what it might mean to you. So just ways fools are going to show themselves to be foolish by their actions. The wise man, who's always going to tend toward the right, doing what's right, can prove his wisdom by the way he lives, by what he does. And then Solomon here says, if the anger of the ruler rises against you, do not leave your place, for deference will make amends for great offenses. And so here in this, he's talking about how. Do what's that? Yeah. 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 But, you look at this, and the idea is, you take a wise man and a fool and put them in the same situation, and notice how differently they're going to react to it. And what the fool's going to do is, he's there, and the ruler, the king, gets angry at him for something that he's done, and the fool is likely just going to walk off. He's going to get mad, and he's going to leave. But he said, listen, if the ruler is angry against you, don't leave your place. Don't get angry yourself and walk off. But rather, he says, for deference will make amends for great offenses. See, a wise man, if he's in a situation where the ruler's gotten angry at him, instead of getting angry himself and leaving, he's going to do what he can to make things right with the ruler, with the king, to try to appease his anger. Because Solomon says deference will make amends for great offenses. You behave in that way, even though you may have done something that's offended the king and he's angered at it, if you do it right, you handle it correctly, you can make amends for it. And the king will come to love you again. Now, as he mentions that, the way it would be done, think again of one of Solomon's Proverbs, contrast that, Proverbs 15:1. A soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. So how do you handle a situation if your boss gets mad at you and he shows that anger because of something you've done? Too many times when somebody gets angry at us, we respond by getting angry. And that's only going to make it worse for you. But if you can, answer with a soft answer, if you can respond in the right way, you can turn the anger of the king back to being calm and being at peace with you. And so how do you handle it? And again, how the wise man does it, how the foolish man does it, is totally different. Again, Brother Kaufman made this statement about it. He said, don't run when accused. They might think you're guilty. And I thought about that, and all of these shows that I've seen on TV, crime shows, not something made up, but it's actual crime cases. When people are brought to trial, this is one of the things it seems like I always talk about. How did this person react when he's questioned about some crime? Well, if he takes off running, if he skips town, well, that's a pretty good sign he's probably guilty. And so if the king's angry at you because of something you've done, don't get mad and walk off. That's just kind of promoting the idea that you were wrong, that you deserve, whatever he does to you. But respond in a positive way, in a good way, to show that calmness and try to make peace with the ruler, so that everything can be corrected and made right again. Now, so don't run when accused. They may think you're guilty. Verses 5 through 7. Again, he's continuing. He's giving Proverbs, but a little bit different. Because in this, he sees two evils in government. Now when I read that, I thought, well, hey, he's doing pretty good. If all he sees is two evils in government, that's pretty good. What would he think if he was living in America today and the things that he sees going on? But look at what he says here in these few verses. Here's an evil which I have seen under the sun, as it were, an error proceeding from the ruler. Folly is set in many high places, and the rich sit in a low place. I have seen slaves on horses, and princes walking on foot like slaves. Now, when you look at that first, it may be kind of hard to figure out to you what in the world is Solomon talking about. He said there are two evils that he sees in this. And evil number one, he says, proceeds from a ruler, where folly is set in many high places and the rich sit in a low place. So I think what he's talking about is where you have someone in a position of leadership who's totally incompetent, who is not ready and able to handle the responsibilities of that position that he's in. He's not a capable leader. He's not going to be able to do the right things and make the right decisions and lead people in the right way. And one of the things that a person has to be careful of as a leader when he's doing this, and again, just to look at the verse, the way let me read it here. Folly is set in many high places, and the rich sit in a low place. So the king is, choosing people to serve in his government. And sometimes what he does, he chooses people that aren't really capable of leadership, of handling the position they're put into. And the rich person sits in a low place. Now, it may be what Solomon's saying about the rich person, may be a person who, because of his riches, maybe he's been able to get a better education. He's had more opportunities, being in positions where he's got to lead, and he's developed leadership abilities, and yet he's not in a position of leadership. He's over here in the lowly place. He's doing the work of a common slave. And the person who has absolutely no talents and no abilities has been chosen by the king and put into a position of authority that he's not prepared for, not ready for. Now, one example of this might be with Rehoboam. When Rehoboam became king, he was wondering what to do, and he wasn't ready for leadership. And so he asked some of the older men what he should do. Do you remember what they told him? Yeah, lighten the load. Solomon has put such tremendous burdens and taxes upon these people. You go in and reduce that and make it easier, and they'll love you and they'll follow you. And then he called in the young men, those who were his own age, and he asked them, what's your advice? What should I do to the people? Because the people are wanting me to. That's what they've demanded, is to reduce these taxes. So what did the young men tell him to do? Yeah, you increase it. You tell the people, do you think Solomon had high taxes on you? Well, my little finger is going to be heavier on you than Solomon's thigh. In other words, I'm going to make it far worse for you. And I'm going to increase your tax. Well, what happened as a result? That divided the kingdom. The northern kingdom revolted against that, and so they left. The 10 tribes formed the northern kingdom of Israel, left Rehoboam with 2 tribes, Jerusalem and with Benjamin, the 2 tribes of the south. And so the kingdom is now divided because of that. Because you had people that you put into positions of authority. And all right, let you make the decisions, and I'll do what you tell me to do. And because they weren't prepared for that, it led to the leadership, or the kingdom itself, being divided. One individual said, any government, especially that of an autocratic ruler, that elevates unworthy men to positions of honor and compels the true nobility of the land to stand as their inferiors, is headed for disaster. And Adam Clarke commented on it, said, not only have a few sovereigns who did such things had very uncomfortable and troublesome reigns, but some have even lost their lives or their kingdoms, because they put people in charge to do things that weren't really ready for. So that's the first evil he says, is when you have a ruler putting people that are incompetent into positions of authority, of leadership, when they're not ready for that. And as a result, everything goes wrong. But the second evil, he says, evil number 2, he says, I have seen slaves on horses and princes riding like slaves. Now, normally, to ride on horseback, that's the position of a person in leadership. The person that's walking is normally the slave. He doesn't have a horse. He doesn't have that type of transportation. He has to walk wherever he goes. So only the poor and the slaves are walking. The others are riding. And someone suggested maybe Solomon remembered back to the time when his rebellious brother Absalom rode on horseback and David was walking, fleeing from Absalom. And so this is another evil he's seen. When you've got somebody in a position of authority, again, someone like Absalom, who's not ready for it. He doesn't have the wisdom and all that's needed. And yet the one that did have it, and the one who'd been chosen by God, is the very one who's walking like a slave. And so Solomon said, I've seen this. And these are two evils that I've seen in life. And, you got to wonder about his own kingdom and his own rule and what it was like. So, you've got to be careful about that. Those who are in positions of leadership need to be careful. The ones that they choose, you don't want to choose the incompetent. And then put those people who could serve very well and do a great job, put them in the lower position like a slave. Now, the next few verses he talks about, beginning there at verse 8, he's talking about here the fact that a man must be careful about his actions unless his foolishness brings harm to himself or to others. And so when you look at the things that he talks about at 8 and 9, he who digs a pit will fall into it, and a serpent will bite him who breaks through a wall. He who quarries stone is hurt by them, and he who splits logs is endangered by them. So, he who digs a pit. Why would a person be digging a pit necessarily? Could be for a well. But look at the context of what he's saying. What's that? Some kind of a trap. And maybe he's setting a trap for somebody else. And he who digs a pit will fall into it. Be careful. If your foolishness is such that you're doing something that's intended to harm someone else, you need to be careful because it may be you who falls into that pit. Great example in the Bible is who? Haman. What did Haman do? He built a gallows for what purpose? To kill Mordecai, hang Mordecai on it. Well, who ended up hanging on it? Haman. Foolishness. When you're doing something intended to hurt someone else, you better be careful because it's liable to come back on you. And not only that, but he says, and a serpent will bite him who breaks through a wall. One of the things that you find this several times in the Bible about breaking into someone's home to steal from them. And they do that through digging through a wall to get to the house. And the Bible talks about, if you find somebody who's dug through the wall inside your house and you kill him, you're justified. Because the fact that he dug through the wall meant he was there to do harm to you or to steal from you. Well, he who digs through a wall maybe is digging through someone's house to get in there to steal something from him. And in the process of digging through, he gets bit by a serpent and dies. Again, if you're doing something sinful, that's foolish, you need to be careful. You need to realize that whatever you're doing it for, it may come back on you. You're hoping to hurt someone else by stealing from them. You might be the one who's hurt by that. And then, verse 9, he who quarries stones is hurt by them, and he who splits logs is endangered by them. Some jobs, just got to realize, some jobs in life are dangerous. And because of that, that's why you need to be careful at those jobs. You don't behave foolishly. I worked 2 summers at Hannah Steel Corporation. I operated a shear cutting steel. Howard Todd, Jr., some of y'all remember Howard, worked there too. His father's one that got his jobs out there. And I remember Howard was cutting the bands on steel. You had to cut it to get that steel out to put it in the shear. And he cut it, and when he did, those things were so tight, and it swung out, and it came right across his elbow. I mean, just split it open big time. And he went running in there to the restroom, and he came back later and called me, and he wanted me to put some Band-Aids on it. And I said, Band-Aids aren't going to help that. Well, you had to go to a doctor and put several stitches in it. Another young man, member of the church there at Woodlawn that worked with us, lost the parts of 2 fingers, cut off in a shear. One young high school guy was working that summer with us, not someone that I knew except there, had a steel coil fall on his foot. He lost his foot. And it got where, before that, as I'm cutting steel, you get a big steel and you throw it through there, and you press down on it, and that thing just keeps going. And you slide it through there against a backstop to cut it a certain length. And you get to that last piece, and you have to push your fingers on up through there to get it back there. And so, there was always that danger. Like I said, we had one of our members lost parts of 2 fingers. Well, when I came back the second summer, they had these paintings all over the wall everywhere, just handprints all over the walls, and the words on it were "Keep 10 on 2." One of the men I worked with, I think, had 3 fingers. He had lost several of them, And then, so they got where they got some kind of deal they could put around your wrist, and when your hands got so far, it automatically, that thing was tied to it, jerk your hands back to keep you from getting your fingers up under there. Well, that second summer they didn't have that. And I was scared to death because of the 3 of us from the church who worked there the summer before and that summer, I was the only one who hadn't been hurt. And I was scared to death that something was going to happen. Fortunately, it didn't. But, it was just realizing there's some jobs that can be dangerous. And the 2 that he mentions here, one that quarries stones, can be hurt by that. Or one who cuts wood can be injured by it. When Don and I lived in Calera, I had a Bible study with a young man. He was paralyzed from the waist down. He was in a wheelchair. He was paralyzed at his job, cutting trees. Don't know for sure what happened. When they found him, he was unconscious, laid out on the ground. And so they're not sure exactly what happened, but it paralyzed him. Just some jobs are dangerous. And that's what he's talking about here, warning the people about that. And because things are dangerous like that, guess what? You don't need to be foolish when you're working at those jobs, And there were a few things that we did sometimes, joking around, that could have caused somebody to get hurt. We had one gentleman, he had a crane operator overhead, and you had a guy that worked with him. And he would hook the crane up to whatever bundle needed to be picked up and carry it over to the station where it needed to be cut. And so he's walking along, and the crane's got that big steel, carried it up, and he's walking along, and I'm cutting steel. And you get through that, get that last little piece of steel, you can't use it, take it and throw it over into the bin. Well, I've got a piece of cardboard that I've cut to a point like this, and I'm waiting for that guy to come along. And as I see him coming along, I just pick up a piece of cardboard and I go, and I yell. And all of a sudden, he just sees something coming, and he screams and throws his hands up and crashes down. Well, it was kind of foolish, because that could have caused him to seriously get hurt. He got even with me, though. I told him, I said, that I'm too smart for you. And I did like that. Sometime later that summer, when I'm setting up the machine, and I've got to get that bar there, measure it to get it right. And then when you cut the steel, then you got to cut the steel and make sure both diagonals are the same length. If it's not, you got to readjust that. So I'm leaning way over on that thing, working on it. And he's got these rubber bands that are about this long and about that thick, and he had about 4 or 5 of them tied together. And so I'm stretched over across there, and he gives it like this, and whop, and he put a blister on me. And I screamed and shot up, and I looked over at him, and boy, and I was just, oh. And I looked over, and he goes, "Yeah, Deke," he said, "you're too smart for me." Anyhow, but people on jobs who sometimes do foolish things, and foolish things can cause people to get hurt, and that's what Solomon is talking about. And so, foolishness is always a dangerous thing about that. So to avoid these problems, what do you do? Well, Solomon suggests using wisdom before you begin a task. You don't want to do something foolish, so make sure you use your wisdom before you begin. And here's what he says, verse 10. If the iron is blunt and one does not whet the edge, he must put forth more strength. But wisdom helps one to succeed. Well, what does wisdom cause him to do? Sharpen that axe. So you can cut it. it'd be a whole lot easier on you and get it done a lot quicker. So you've got to do that. That's the old joke they used to tell about a guy. They bought him a chainsaw, and they had told him, he said, "With that chainsaw, you ought to be able to cut 3 cords of wood in a certain period of time." And he went back to the store with it. He said, "This thing it's taking me all day, and I haven't got a single cord cut." And the guy said, "Really?" And he said, "Yeah." And he said, "Let me see that." And he grabs it, he goes, and the guy jumped back and said, "What's that? What's that?" Now, wisdom could save you a whole lot of time. And you wouldn't have that problem. So Solomon said, listen, use wisdom, especially if you're in a job that's a dangerous thing. Use wisdom to avoid causing yourself to get hurt in some way. If a man's intending to cut wood, he needs to make sure that he has a sharp axe to do it with. One person paraphrased it this way, said, wisdom can make any job easier. If a person sharpens the knife, axe, the job is easier. And wisdom is like that. Likewise, the man who's bitten by a snake, and this is one of the things that he talks about, if the serpent bites before it is charmed, there is no advantage in the charmer. And so he says, it's too late, if you wait till you're bitten by the snake before you charm it, it's too late. What's the old saying we have, it's too late to lock the barn after the horse is out. You've got to be careful about that. But here's the spiritual application of that idea. That idea talks about if the serpent bites before it's charmed, there's no advantage in a charmer. And so here's the advantage of it. Knowing what one has to do in order to be saved, it's too late to learn it if you wait till the moment of your death. If you know what needs to be done to be saved, you need to do it now, not wait, because if you wait till you're dead, it's too late. And so, if you're going to work with a snake, you need to call the charmer first, and don't wait till after you're bitten, and it's too late. And so in our lives, daily lives, we're just learning to use wisdom in what we're doing to make our task easier and to make it more profitable. And the same thing is true with us in our spiritual lives and how we need to do it. Now, the next section he's going to get to here, I'm talking about this, he's going to be really dealing with the speech of a fool and how dangerous that is. There are jobs that are dangerous, but it's dangerous as a fool in listening to what he has to say because of what it can do to you. Our time's gone. We'll begin hopefully at that point next time that we have a meeting. I don't think we'll be having class we'll have it Sunday. Sunday we won't have a class, but Wednesday. So next Wednesday, meet here. We'll begin at this point. That will be at verse 12 in chapter 10. So let's close out, if we would, with a word of prayer. Father, again, we thank Thee for Your love that allows us, Father, the privilege of being Your children, to being able to gather like this with others of Your children, that we might be able to study together from Your Word and hopefully encourage and help one another to become stronger. And Father, that we might in our lives serve Thee better. Dismiss us now in Your care and keep us safe, and allow us to be back, Father, this coming Sunday. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.